Facing you, facing the street.
As you like. I'm not much to look at.
You're
All right,
telling
we are
me.
being recorded, so watch your mouth, BT.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Hare Krishna. Welcome back to the Sunday series Leaps of Faith and Doubt presented by Pracharananda Das. I'm here today hosting instead of Leela, who is away, but she will be back soon.
Here.
And anyway, I will turn it over now to our dear Pracharananda, who will shine the light of knowledge on all of us. Thank you.
Yes, well, I guess considering evolution, the question to ask is if we're talking about our dear Pracharananda was I once a deer? I don't know. Anyway, this presentation is about evolution. I think evolution is the #1 scientific theory that devotees love to hate on. So I'm very happy to be speaking about this today. I will also say that of all of the scientific theories that are being presented in this seminar series, this is probably the one that I know the least about. And so I would also like to acknowledge that a lot of the ideas that I'm presenting here are not actually my own ideas. They're coming from other members of our BI Sangha, including Kandadi Prabhu, who I have the good fortune of sitting right next to today, surprisingly, as well as our friend in the UK, Ramananda, who is a molecular biologist. And so with his permission granted to me about a year ago, I have used some information from some slides that he presented at a BI talk in the Brandywine Village. No, what was it called? What was that place called? Buckland Hall. I knew it had something to do with the Hobbit. And so we've been discussing evolution in the BI since I've joined our local chapter of the BI, where we had a conference called Evolution Narratives and Krishna Consciousness. In this talk, I want to do, before I get into the details of this talk, I just want to review what a scientific theory is, because the word theory in science is used in a rather specific way, which can be kind of pedantic, admittedly, but when talking with scientists, it is important to understand their language and to make sure that there's an agreement on terms. So when we talk about a scientific theory, we are not talking about some idea that somebody has. Well, I have a theory about why the Department of Justice decided to unseal Donald Trump's indictment 3 days early. That's not a theory in the scientific sense, and I'm sorry to bring politics into this so early in the morning, but that was just been on my mind. In a scientific sense, a theory is a well-substantiated explanation of a set of observations that we make in nature. So it's not about one observation, and it's not just one explanation. It's a group of explanations that describe why we observe a whole set of observations in nature. And the nature of these explanations themselves, sorry to use that word repeatedly, but the ontology of these explanations themselves are that, first of all, they have to be falsifiable explanations. So, can you show me evidence that what I'm saying isn't true is different than saying, can you prove this? In science, as we've discussed a few times in the seminar series, we don't actually positively prove anything. We just come up with plausible explanations for things. And those explanations are plausible until somebody shows why they don't work. So theories have to be based on falsifiable explanations. Theories also have to be supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. So a few weeks ago, we spoke about the Big Bang, and there are 4 basic independent lines of evidence that provide evidence for the Big Bang theory. One is the expanding universe, as shown by the redshift of distant astronomical objects, cosmological objects. Another is the relative abundance of light versus heavy isotopes in the universe. A third is the apparent homogeneity and isotropy. Did I say that right? Isotropicness of the universe. And the fourth is, I'm about to draw a blank on, the cosmic microwave background. And so these are 4 different lines of evidence that all can be explained by the same theory. And that's actually a relatively simple theory in that regard. The theory of evolution is a bit more complicated than the Big Bang theory, in my opinion, as far as how well substantiated the evidence is or possible explanations of what the evidence means. But the process of coming up with the theory remains the same. And then finally, a scientific theory has to be in agreement with pre-existing experimental results, and it has to be accurate. It has to be at least as accurate in its predictions as pre-existing theories. So one thing that we've discussed about regarding the epistemology of science is that science has to be predictive in nature. And so a new scientific theory or a new part of a scientific theory has to be at least as accurately predictive as what came before it. And so these are some of the guidelines of formulating a scientific theory. Regarding evolution, there's really no such thing as an evolutionary scientist. There's no one, like if you go to the university of whatever and say, I want to study evolution, there's no department of evolutionary science in a university. Rather, evolution is studied by a whole host of different types of scientists, paleontologists, zoologists, geneticists, microbiologists, climatologists, and so on and so forth. And they all have their lines of evidence that would seem to support what we call the theory of evolution. What is the theory of evolution? What are we talking about when we talk about the theory of evolution? And now I just want to be clear that for at least the first half, if not 60 to 70% of this presentation, I am simply presenting the science of evolution without fear or favor. And so one of our purposes in this lecture series and one of our purposes in revisiting the original Origins publication from the 80s is to make sure that devotees have the information they need to discuss these things intelligently with scientists. This is part of our preaching mission, is to reach out to scientists. We have ample evidence from Srila Prabhupada's own life and his own writings that preaching to the intelligent class of men, the scientific community, was very important to him. And in doing so, we need to understand what their arguments are. And I have some quotes from Srila Prabhupada that I may read later that speak to this. But I just want to be clear that I'm not presenting this theory as all devotees should believe this theory because this is the theory. I'm just presenting this theory as it is so that when we want to engage with the scientific community, we're at least not, I'm going to say, making fools of ourselves by not knowing what we're talking about. So what is the theory of evolution? The theory of evolution is a theory that explains why we see a diversity of species of living creatures on Earth. And it explains how this variety appeared based on biological change over generations. So in the Darwinian sense, and then the neo-Darwinian or the modern Darwinian sense, evolution is not something that happens to an individual. It happens to a population within a species. And it's the modification of that species as it descends through time to successive generations. And this is caused by genetic mutation, and it's also caused by natural selection. So there are factors that relate to evolution on a molecular level, and then there are factors that relate to evolution on an environmental and even an abiotic level, or things that don't specifically have to do with life. And so we have a population. A population is the number of any one species in a habitat or an ecosystem. And populations can either be in equilibrium, which means they're not changing over time, or they can be evolving, which means they are changing over time. Factors that lead away from equilibrium and into evolution are basically codified, and I'm taking this now from the 9th grade biology textbook that we use at the Bhaktivedanta Academy, which is recognized by the state of Florida. I don't know if that's an endorsement or not, but there you go. I find it actually to be a very good textbook. But anyway, there are 5 factors that lead a species or a population of a species away from equilibrium and into evolution. And they are non-random mating is the first one. We're just not all sleeping with everybody and seeing what sticks. I am only mating with American Jewish women between the ages of 25 and 35. So there you go. And that leads to very small populations. No, small population size can lead to evolution because, as we'll see in future slides, the evolution basically relates to the change in allele frequency in a population over time. And if you have a small population, any incremental change in the allele frequency will affect the whole population to a greater extent. Genetic diversity can also be influenced by immigration and emigration. This is other members of that species from a different population moving into the population, or members of the population moving away from the population. Immigration and emigration There are mutations which happen on a genetic level, and there's natural selection. So these are the factors that influence whether a population will be evolving or not. They overlap to a certain extent with the mechanisms of evolution. So the main mechanisms of evolution are natural selection, the bottleneck and the founder effects, and isolation of within a population. I have some images that will illustrate these better than the words. So this is natural selection. Natural selection is a function of the environment, not the organism. And this is one of the areas where Darwin and Lamarck actually greatly differed. Lamarck said that it's the individual that is evolving to meet the needs of the environment, and then it's passing those adaptations on to successive generations. And of course, this idea has been ridiculed by evolutionary biologists basically since Darwin and Wallace published their work. But in the light of new understanding of holistic understandings of ecosystems, the understandings of genetics and whatnot, some of that's being revisited, as we'll talk about later in the program. But natural selection is a function of the environment, that there are individuals within a species in an environment that are better adapted to live in that environment than others. And the environment will select those for more successful reproduction. And there are three types of natural selection. There's directional selection, which is up here on the top, where the environment will move the entire distribution in one direction or another. So this is the distribution of beak sizes within a bird population, and directional selection is selecting for the population with the larger beak size. So the entire distribution is moved directionally towards larger beak size. It could also go towards smaller beak size, depending on the environment. There's what's called stabilizing selection, which is that the extremes of the distribution are cut off and it's stabilized more in the mean. And so you don't get a perfect bell curve distribution, but you get a higher concentration of traits within the median range. Or you could have disruptive selection, in which case something that happens that creates a bimodal distribution of whatever trait you're looking at. And we're looking at beak size here, but this could be any trait within a population. There's a founder effect, which is that if you have a population and then these four, I don't know what these are, ladybugs, I guess, some kind of bug. These four decide, hey, you know, I hear there's some nice land up in Union County with lower taxes. Let's go over there and settle. So now the genetic diversity of the founding population in a new geographic area is more limited than the genetic diversity of the original population. And so this is a founder effect. And you can see, well, these guys are like, I don't know about Union County. Let's go south to Micanopy. And so now you get from this original population of yellow, gray, and red bugs, you get a split population of yellow and gray or yellow and red bugs. So this is a founder effect. Bottleneck effect is very similar to this. The bottleneck effect often happens when there is a catastrophe within a habitat that drastically reduces the population size. And the population that's left over after the catastrophe has a limited gene pool to draw from, and then they will repopulate that area, drawing from a limited gene pool. And so that's the bottleneck effect related to the founder effect. Finally, we have isolation. This is showing specifically reproductive isolation. This is, you have a mixed population where everybody's mating with each other, and then something happens that would cause selective reproduction amongst the population. And if that happens, suddenly the purple will get split back out into its blue and red components. There's reproductive isolation. There's also temporal isolation, which is that you may have a species of birds, but half of them like to mate in the fall and the other half of them like to mate in the spring. And so that will create two different basically two different gene pools within that population. And over time, those gene pools, as the theory will say, will lead to different types of species of the original bird. There's also geographic isolation, which is what Darwin noted when he saw the finches in the Galapagos. There was examples of geographic isolation. So those are the factors and the mechanisms that lead to evolution. So this is how evolutionists or evolutionary people, I guess, describe how and why evolution happens. And here are the divergent lines of evidence that support the idea that this is in fact happening in the world. And there are 5 of them that I'm going to talk about briefly. think we're doing okay with time. The first is biogeography, which is the global distribution of organisms and the unique features of island species, and how these reflect evolution and geological change. Regarding, let me just talk about fossils also. Fossils document the existence of now extinct species and how they relate to present day species. So the fossil record, which admittedly is an extremely limited record of all of the rocks on Earth, does, with very, very few outliers, show a one-way directional march from simple to complex living entities. And we see this both within the evolution of individual species in the fossil record. For example, ammonites or trilobites, as they evolved throughout the Paleozoic, they became more complex before going extinct. And we also see this in so that's intraspecies evolution. We also observe this in the fossil record in previous one was intraspecies. We also observe this in interspecies evolution, that generally the fossil record shows organisms as a whole going from more simple to more complex. Darwin knew this, and it's important to note that when Darwin was doing his work, this was around the time when humans started to understand that the Earth is way older than Bishop Ussher estimated it to be back in the 15th century or whatever. And so there's geology, and there's also sort of crossbreeding between scientists that led to Darwin's theory. Darwin certainly was not working in a vacuum, and Darwin certainly drew on other people's work, even from other scientific disciplines, to formulate his species. There's anatomical evidence. I've mentioned here homologous structures. A homologous structure is a different physical structure in a body that serves the same purpose for different species. So, for example, a bird's wing and a whale's flipper and our hands are homologous structures. The bone structures are all the same, but they serve different functions. There are also analogous structures, which are different structures that serve the same purpose. So my eye is made to see things in the world. A bee's eye is also made to see things in the world, but they're actually completely different structures. Those are analogous structures. There are also vestigial structures, which are structures that I have in my body that no longer serve an obvious purpose, but are just left over from what I've evolved out of. Finally, carrying on, there's molecular biological evidence, there's relationships, there's chromosomal evidence among species, and there's also evidence of evolving genetic diversity within the genetic code between species. So what makes us most related to chimpanzees, for example, is that our DNA is most similar to the chimpanzee. And as we go back down the line of primates, it starts to diverge more and more and more. I'll talk more about that in a second. And finally, there is some direct evidence of evolution, at least intraspecies evolution. For example, there are variants of bugs, I want to say bacteria. So bacteria evolve in response to medication. Penicillin is no longer strong enough to kill a lot of the bacterial infections we get. So we come up with a new antibacterial medication, and the bacteria evolves to become resistant to that. So there is also direct observational evidence. There's some evidence from history also, the moths, for example. So let me just talk about each one of these more in depth. The first one is biogeography. This one shows Wallace's line and Weber's line, and this shows across this line here, which goes through Oceania. To the west of this line, all of the fauna, all of the plant species strongly resemble those in Asia. And if you go to the east of this line, all of the flora and fauna represent that which is found throughout Australia and the other parts of Oceania. And this is explained by, this is not a great image of it, but the line that is Wallace's line is defined by bathymetry, by the depth of the ocean there. And this line goes along the deepest part of this strait here. And the idea is that during the last ice age, when there's an ice age, ocean sea levels drop considerably because a lot of seawater is tied up in ice. The ocean was about 120 meters shallower here, which allowed plant spores and animals to easily cross over this strait. So there's a bit of a transition zone here between the flora and the fauna. But if you go further to the west, they're very distinct, because as the sea levels rose again, it created this isolation. geographic isolation, and species can no longer get across this strait that easily, and therefore we have very different flora and fauna in Asia than we do in Oceania. There's other, and this is where biogeography and fossil evidence starts to overlap, is that there's evidence of, for example, Glycopteris is a fern-like plant that has been found from anywhere from the middle of Antarctica to Central Africa or Central Southern Africa and Central South America. So what in the modern times is widely divergent climates, we find fossil evidence of the same plant. And this is where evidence of evolution and evidence of plate tectonic theory start to overlap. This is suggestive that at one time all of these continents were in the same place and they split apart. Otherwise, how would this plant get across the ocean? Fossil evidence, this is evidence of the evolution of a horse. This was done by Bruce McFadden, who's the director of the Florida Museum of Natural History at our own University of Florida. So this is some pretty local evidence, I would say. This is done pretty locally. And I'm not an expert on this at all, but I have done some searching through data banks of peer-reviewed scientific literature. And if you just Google, so the question here now arises, I'm just going to go on a little bit of a side quest. So amongst religious communities, and I've spoken to devotees about this a lot, and I've also spoken to Christians of various denominations and Jews and people from a lot of religious backgrounds who have issues with the theory of evolution, because we want to believe that life came from life and that God is a perfect designer of the machines of the material body. And yet we are confronted with some evidence that there is evolution occurring that doesn't necessarily need the intervention of an almighty God to happen. And so religious people from various faiths and backgrounds try to reconcile this. And one way that I've often heard it reconciled is that, okay, there might be microevolution, which is that bacteria may evolve or humans may evolve within the human form, but they'll fundamentally remain humans. But there's really no evidence of one species turning into another species via the process of evolution. And so not having the time, the energy, or the educational background to do that kind of investigation on my own, I just Googled, how many peer-reviewed papers since 1980 are presenting fossil evidence of evolution. And there are about 26,000 of them in Science Direct, or Elsevier, which is a premier scientific research data bank. And if you narrow that down and if you look for fossil evidence of microevolution, there are about 3,500 peer-reviewed articles since 1980. So 3,500 peer-reviewed articles, how many is that really? Is that a lot? Is that a little? I will say that
Macro or macro?
about macroevolution, there are 3,500. About fossil evidence for evolution in general, there are about 26,000. I can tell you, as a person who used to work at a university who was under a lot of pressure to publish papers and knows how that system works, if a professor is publishing 5 peer-reviewed papers a year, they're doing pretty well. And so you can imagine so you can do the math, how many professors, how many different research groups are involved in this. And this is not to say that the fossil evidence for macroevolution is correct. It is just to say that if we want to debate this matter using scientific language, this is what we're up against. Right? This is what we're up against. I will say, from my own research into this area about the fossil evolution for fossil evidence for macroevolution, the examples that are available to lay people in the literature are pretty limited. There's the horse, there's the whale. I think I got the whale coming up here. The whale. Yeah, the horse and the whale are the two most prominent ones. And so the whale, did the whale evolve from a mouse deer? Well, according to modern evolutionary theory, yeah, it did. Here's the mouse deer, here's the whale, and you can see, so this is showing where the structures so in each successive advance along the chain here, there's a new adaptation that's giving the living entity a survival advantage in the environment. And you can see where all of these successive adaptations are encoded in the modern whale. So these are the two main examples, the horse and the whale. There are other examples. There's some pretty good evidence of the fossil transition between fish to amphibians, and when fauna, animals first started walking on land, is another example from more distant paleontology. So there's fossil evidence. Talking about homologous structures, I gave this example: the human hand, the dog's foot, the bird's wing, and the whale's fin or flipper all have the same structure, but they serve slightly different purposes. The human's hand is mainly for grabbing and fine motor skills like that. The dog's foot is for walking. The bird's wing is for flying. The whale's fin is for swimming, which is similar to flying underwater, but still somewhat different. But the fundamental structure is all the same. And you can trace the development of these structures also back to the genome of the individual. So this isn't just an accident that these developed this way. This is encoded in the genetics of these animals. I also mentioned analogous structures. So birds have wings, flies have wings, bats have wings. These are all different structures, but they all serve the same purpose. So these are examples of how life is related to itself. This is an example of homologous structures within the brains of mammals, starting with monotremes, which are mammals, the most primitive mammals, and marsupials, which don't. So monotremes are mammals that lay eggs. Marsupials are mammals that bear their young in a pouch. And then placentals are animals that bear their young in a placenta. But these are homologous structures in the brain for the visual cortex, the audio cortex, and somatosensory, that's the sense of touch, and how these are shared throughout mammalian species. Carrying on with DNA evidence. So on the top, we have more phenotypical evidence. So this is evidence of macroscopic traits that you can see. And this shows how what's called a clade. So this is a group of animals, how they're formed. So at some point, of vertebrates. So this is the clade of phylum Chordata, which are animals with vertebrate backbones. And so at some point down here where this starts, there was a backbone. And then different features started evolving along the backbone stem. So the lamprey had jaws, the tuna, jaws evolved between the lamprey and the tuna. Walking legs, so this is where the amphibians came in, evolved between the tuna and the salamander. And so at each step, something branches off into a new evolutionary line. And this here shows what they share in common. The leopard has hair, and it's the only one with the hair. And then you can go down. This is what they all share in common like this. So these are macroscopic traits, but you can also do the same exercise using genetics. So this is how much, this is the number of amino acid difference between hemoglobin polypeptide. So a polypeptide bond is the kind of bond that holds different amino acids together to form proteins. This is the protein hemoglobin, which is responsible for carrying oxygen in our blood to facilitate cellular respiration. And this is the number of differences between a lamprey's hemoglobin polypeptide bonds and a human's hemoglobin polypeptide bonds. There's a lot of them, but if you compare the human to another primate, the macaque, there's only 8 differences. And so we are closer evolutionarily to the macaque than we are to the lamprey, but we are still related to the lamprey in many important ways. So DNA evidence. Again, if we put all of this together, we get this vision of the tree of life. And I really love this image. It starts here with the beginning of the earth at 4.5 billion years. And here's where the first living thing appeared at about 4 billion years ago. And then it spreads off from that. And around here, you can see the labels of the different phylum and taxa. You can also see here where there are mass extinction events that lead to a bottleneck effect and a new founder effect. And you can also see where this is a pretty low resolution image that I have just for the PowerPoint. But if you find this online, there are very high resolution images of it where you can zoom in onto each tiny little branch here, and you can see what split off and what trait was added or lost at the split. And so it's all of this combined evidence, and this is again not the work of one person, and it's also not the work of just a few decades. People have been studying this stuff for over 200 years at this point, and this is the work of many people. And so this is also illustrative of the scientific principle of knowledge being cumulative, that it adds up over time. And it's also dependent on, it's iterative, it's also dependent on the people that came before us. So Darwin's theory was tied to the idea that the Earth was actually very old. The idea that the Earth was very old was an iteration in scientific knowledge that allowed these other ideas to then become plausible. Darwin's ideas have subsequently been substantiated and validated by genetics. Darwin didn't know anything about genetics, but what we do know of genetics, to a certain extent, very much strongly supports Darwin's idea. So the study of genetics provides predictive validation for what Darwin was talking about. Now, there are some issues with this, and this is where I'm bringing in some material from some of our other BI members. There are a few premises upon which this theory is based. The first is that the DNA is the blueprint of life, and all life is coded in DNA. It's the universal code. And if you study biology in a college or a high school or whatever, when they teach you about the 8 features of life, they will teach you that life is based on a universal genetic code, and that code is DNA. Another premise of this is that we do not inherit traits from other species, that the evolution happens within a population and it doesn't affect other populations. So whatever's going on in this chicken population here is not affecting the cat population, which is not affecting the dog population, which is not affecting the donkey population, that it's species-specific inheritance, and we don't mix. These are Ramananda's jokes. Ramananda, if you're listening, thank you again. The third premise that this is based on is that basically trauma or life history is not inheritable, is the gene cells or the reproductive cells of the living entity are not really affected by the environment, and they're passed on as they are to successive generations. So if I lose my arm, that's not going to mean that doesn't mean I'm going to have babies without an arm, right? There's a separation between the somatic cells of the body, which are damaged in this, that, and the other thing, and the germ cells of the body, which are responsible for reproduction. So let's just, I just want to raise a question about the first one here, about DNA being the blueprint of life. So when DNA is transcribed, or when it's reproduced, there are a lot of errors involved in this. There are all kinds of mutations that go on, and the body has a proofreading mechanism that reduces those errors. And drawing from this guy, Mr. Noble, and again, I'm taking this from Ramananda, that when DNA is first transcribed, about 1 in 10,000 base pairs of nucleic acids are coded wrong. 1 in 1,000. That's a lot. 1 in 10,000. Thank you. Yeah. But there is a protein in the body that will proofread the whole strip, and it would reduce that error to about what is that? That's 10 billion. To 1 in 10 billion, which is a lot less. So the body automatically has a corrective mechanism in it, and that raises the question of how could. And so let me step back. So what the corrective mechanism does is it makes the DNA an extremely statistically reproducible molecule. It can be reproduced quickly and accurately all the time. But it raises the question as to if it requires this proofreading mechanism to do that, how could it have evolved without the proofreading mechanism? And so what came first? And it would appear that even on a genetic level, that the DNA isn't operating as a one-way street. So this is what's called the central dogma of biology, is that information within an organism flows in one direction from the most simple to the most complex, which would say that it starts with the DNA and goes all the way to the higher ordered organism, which is us. But there's some genetic evidence which suggests that that is not always true, if it is true at all, that there's something else that is correcting and monitoring the transcription of the DNA, which is allowing it to go on so accurately. We can come back to that in a moment. Another one is so the next one is the questions of species-specific inheritance. And we see now with modern, for example, the Gaia hypothesis of James Lovelace and subsequent studies of ecosystems as a whole organism rather than the individual parts of the ecosystems, that we do see that there's a lot of, pardon the term, let's say crossover between inheritance. So there's what's called the holobiont, which are assemblages of different species that form ecological units. And we see that the ecological unit itself appears to be a living entity, or appears to have consciousness of its own, and it's made up of all of these individual parts. And then the ecosystem will evolve according to the mechanisms that we laid out before. The holobiont is based on the hologenome, which is the collective genetic information of all of the organisms in the ecosystem. And so these things create, I'm just going to skip down to the bottom here. These things create what are called evolutionary melting pots. So they create systems where genetic information can crossbreed with itself. And we do see evidence even within human population that, for example, up to or greater than 8% of all human DNA is viral in origin. So 8% of us is DNA from viruses. And viruses actually provide a efficient mechanism to transfer DNA from one type of organism to another. So, for example, COVID, the reigning theory, although I'm sure this is subject to many devotional conspiracy theories, very devotional conspiracy theories. The reigning theory is that this came out of a bat, right? But then it entered human DNA, and then this gets into our cells and it can alter our DNA. And so now we've got some bat DNA. If you've had COVID, you've just been introduced to some bat virus. So I don't know the details of how that works, but it is clear that viruses do spread DNA across species. Another example of non-species specific inheritance goes to the idea of symbiogenesis. So I want to just make a point here that the theory of evolution does not address the origins of life. So one of Prabhupada's main objections to the theory of evolution is that life does not come from matter, or consciousness did not arise out of a mature state of matter. Consciousness is its own ontological thing that is a symptom of life and not a consequence of life. And in discussing this, often devotees want to find fault in the theory of evolution for not addressing this issue. But I just want to be clear that the theory of evolution does not address the origin of life. It addresses how life has evolved once it started. And so we shouldn't conflate these two arguments in our outreach mission. But here's an example of non-species specific inheritance. And this is how evolutionary biologists believe that eukaryotic or advanced cells evolved. So the first cells that we have fossil evidence of, prokaryotic cells, were just a cell membrane with some DNA inside of it. And cell membranes are constructed as such that things can get in and out of the cell membrane without the need for energy being added to them, although there are also mechanisms with which energy is required. So if this one prokaryotic cell got a hold of this other prokaryotic cell, now you've got this little bit of DNA became the nucleus of a newer, more advanced cell. And this thing that got eaten is now evolving into the mitochondria, which is the thing that facilitates cellular respiration in animal and plant cells. Now, if I add a third bit into here, a cyanobacterium, which is a prokaryotic cell, now this gets in here, this can evolve into a chloroplast, and suddenly I have a modern or a eukaryotic plant cell. But this is constructed of the DNA of 3 different non-related or non-species specific living entities. So the idea of species-specific inheritance is widely been debunked. There's tons of evidence of this not happening. Finally, there's the question of epigenetics, and can my life history then become somehow encoded in my DNA? Whether or not it gets encoded in the DNA is up to debate, but the epigenetics is certainly a factor. So epigenetics are environmental factors that dictate what parts of our genetic code get activated and what parts of our genetic code get left dormant. And the example here is that if a woman is smoking while she's pregnant, although her smoking itself is not changing her DNA, it can dictate what parts of her DNA are going to get activated in certain sequences. And this can then subsequently affect not only the development of the child, but the development of the child's germ cells. And so On an epigenetic level, a pregnant woman smoking can actually affect 3 generations of allele frequencies within the population. So all 3, finally, I forgot to put the slide in there. Finally, is the question of, is life slowly fortuitous, which means, are things always evolving in such a way to improve our lives or to make life more resilient? And we don't see this happening in many cases. So this is an example, and I put this very complicated diagram in here, not because I'm going to explain it to you, and also not because I know what it means, but only to illustrate that if we are going to really get into the details of these issues with scientists, there are people out there who do understand what that means. And if we are going to present a convincing argument to them, we need to be able to explain what is wrong with that. And I don't think I think the number of devotees in the world who can do that is extremely limited. And so if this is a matter that really interests you, I would strongly encourage you to educate yourselves on the details of it. Because again, this is what we're up against. It's not that these people, it's not that this is, there's 5 guys sitting in some deep state back room concocting some theory to bewilder all of us. It's that people do study this stuff. But this is an example here of an animal with a flagella. That's this little tail here. And if you cut the flagella off, they will regrow the tail because the code in the DNA is still there for it to grow. And so the thing gets cut off, there's some signals sent to the cells, and cells, oh, we got to regrow our flagella. So, but what scientists have done in this case is that they've gone and using CRISPR technology or gene editing technology, they've gone into these, I think this is a paramecia. They've gone into these single-celled living entities, and they've actually removed the code for the flagella from the living entity, and then they cut the flagella off. And the living entity will rewrite the code to grow the flagella, but it won't be the same code. And so again, this relates back to the first piece of evidence, that it is the DNA a one-way street. And this is evidence that actually, no, it isn't. The living entity will figure out a way to rewrite the code to grow the flagella, and it won't even be the same thing that it was originally coded in there, which raises the idea or the question of, is DNA really a blueprint, or is it more of a template that can be drawn on when I need something? So there's an aspect of the DNA that can create something that I need, but the living entity is adaptive to what the code actually says, or it can work with what the code to make what it wants. And this brings me just to the last slide, the last point, which again is from Ramananda, and I also want to give Akandati here some credit for, oh, I'm missing a couple of things here, for coming up with some of these ideas, is that it would seem, and I think that there are modern biologists out there that would be sympathetic to this, and might also be able to provide us some assistance regarding where to look for evidence or what type of research can be done, is that it would appear as though the central dogma of biology, which is that genetic information flows in a one-way street from the simplest to the most complex organization of the living entity, isn't necessarily true. And it would appear as though the living entity's will has some influence over what is going on the molecular level. And so we kind of want to turn this over on its head, and show that instead of the information going from the genes to the proteins to the cells, the tissues, and up to the organism itself is having influence on these lower levels of organization. And so this is an example, and I think, again, I want to give a little credit to Akandati here. I think this is really brilliant the way he's done this, and I think that this is an example of how we should be engaging with the scientific community, is that we are not attempting to throw out the evidence that the evolutionary scientists have presented us. That would seem to be a fool's mission. Rather, we are looking to provide alternative explanations for what that evidence means. And so it's not that all of these mechanisms that I presented to you in the beginning of the presentation are wrong. It's that the scientists may not fully understand what it's pointing to. And so here's an example of where we have some things that we could offer to the scientific community in terms of what is the nature of the self, what is the nature of consciousness, how is consciousness fundamental to driving all of these auxiliary processes that lead to the evolution of life as we observe it. So there's so much more that can be said about this. I didn't even touch the issue of 8.4 million species. I think I'm going to touch the issue of 8.4 million species in 2 minutes right now. So modern scientists have discovered about 1.2 to 1.3 million species of life on this planet. And they think that there are about 8 million species of life, but they also say that it will take hundreds of years for them to find them all. And by then we will most certainly all be dead. The Srila Prabhupada, drawing on the authority of the Vedas, said often and emphatically that there are 8.4 million forms of life and they don't change. So I think the model that we are presenting is that, yeah, there are 8.4 million forms of life that don't change. Oddly enough, we talk about these forms of life as permutations of the modes of nature, but 8.4 million doesn't have a perfect cubed root. So it would be difficult to try to find a perfect species for each perfect permutation of the modes of nature. Be that as it may, it's not clear that all 8.4 million species of life are present on every planet at every time. So it may be that there's some here now that weren't here in the past. And so that although we don't see dinosaurs on Earth anymore, that doesn't mean there aren't dinosaurs existing in other parts of the universe. But what we would propose is that it's not the body that's evolving, it's the consciousness of the living entity that is evolving through the bodies, and therefore the free will of the organism has some effect on the molecules that create its machine. So we agree that it's the DNA that's making up the machine of the body, but it's the living entity that's operating the body within its limits. And as the living entity becomes more purified, either through cultivating the mode of goodness or through association with the Bhagavat devotees of the Lord, our ability to perceive in the sensual world expands. So demigods have much greater power of perception than humans do. Humans have much greater power of perception than ants do, but it's not because the human body evolved from the ant's body, it's because the living entity in the human body has evolved up through different species of life. So I think this is the general model that we're trying to present. And I think there are threads of modern science that would support this, and I would encourage us to try to explore those as further as we can. And on that note, I'm going to stop not knowing what I'm talking about and
We can draw a screen share now.
open it up to your angry questions. Angry questions, go ahead. Leela loves. All right, we love you too, Leela. We got someone in the chat window. Oh, BPP. Welcome. Padmanabha Swami. Contact me on Facebook the other day. Glad you can make it.
Let me ask a question, if I might.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, two areas to explore. We'll start with one. The role of consciousness in evolution
Yeah.
really takes us into the realm of philosophy of science.
Yeah.
And those really good philosophers of science, be it John Lennox or Stephen Myers, who look at it, do not, these two happen to be Christians, but they do not challenge the general trend we see of simple to complex.
Yeah.
But they do challenge that the mechanism which that can occur, because it requires consciousness. It requires information that comes from consciousness. So how can that be demonstrated?
Well, I don't know. I think that's the question. I mean, one of the things I want to do with this talk, again, because this is not a topic that I'm, I need to plug in my computer. You know, my knowledge of this or my expertise in this really comes from teaching high school biology.
Okay.
You know, I have some expertise in it from the geological aspects of it. And regarding things like chemical evolution and the evolution of stars and planets, certainly know a lot more about that. What?
Plug behind you.
Okay. Thanks.
Second,
but hold on. So one of the things I'm doing here is I'm trying to frame questions, and I think you've framed a very good one.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Second question, unrelated to the first for the most part, is Judah Karma in Forbidden Archaeology and Hidden History of the Human Race and all has pointed out that there are unresolved discrepancies
Yeah,
involved with a term that Sariputta may have coined, the knowledge filter. That is, that if data supports the conventional theories, you can get it peer reviewed and published. If it
Yeah.
doesn't, you can't. And I witnessed this very dramatically in the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Lab, in which the dean of engineering at Princeton
yeah,
could not get articles published based on very well-established data collection
yeah,
standards. So the contention of Judah Karma and Sariputta in the Forbidden Archaeology was there is a data filtering going on. So there's other information that's rejected, and this information would imply, if true, that our model of evolution, that's the standard model, let's call it that way, the standard
sure. Yeah,
neo-Darwin model,
not to
has
be
flaws
confused
in
with
it.
the standard model of particle
Physics,
physics.
yeah, standard model of evolution called the neo-Darwin, I think is the
Sure.
term now, has major flaws in it. Is this something you studied or have any comment on?
Comment on, I can certainly do this, having been exposed to the peer review science,
Yeah,
peer
yeah.
review process in science quite a bit. So certainly there's a knowledge filter, as I think just a flaw of human nature. I don't think the knowledge filter is conspiratorial in nature, because so when an article is submitted for peer review, even in a top tier scientific journal like Nature or Science, at most there's going to be 4 people reviewing that.
Yeah, correct.
And if you're reviewing at a lower level, I mean, I've had papers published with 1 reviewer, which is not right. Of course I'm taking the publication, but that should not happen. And so when we talk about peer review in science, it's not like there's a committee of 100 people who are sitting around pouring through every piece of evidence in this paper. There's 2 or 3 totally overworked professors who are not getting any credit for reviewing that paper, who are just trying to get it done. And so things do get overlooked. People's personal biases do come into play all the time. And I know from talking to my own department chair when I worked at the University of Alberta, that because I didn't believe Judah Karma so much, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I've not seen this, but I asked my own department chair once if he had any experience of this, and he said he does actually. He's got some outlandish ideas about the formation of the Canadian Sedimentary Basin and whatnot. And he told me that when he hires grad students, he needs to warn them that if his name is on their publications, there's a risk that they won't get published just because he's been blackballed by publications for having ideas that don't conform with the status quo. So that does go on, but I think that is more mundane human politics than knowledge conspiracies trying to keep the theists out of the ivory tower or whatever. Regarding Sataputta's claims specifically and forbidden archaeology and stuff, that I will say that there are some pieces of evidence in that book that are legitimately anomalous, that cannot be explained and and deserve explanation. There are also a lot of pieces of evidence in that book which are now fairly commonplace on the internet or whatever, that have been debunked. So, which is cool. I'm not finding any fault in their research, but that's the nature of research, is that somebody makes a claim and then somebody else can come and show, well, that's not actually true. So I think that issues of knowledge filters and the validity of evidence that's being presented really needs to be addressed on a case-by-case basis, and it's dangerous to draw too many generalizations about that. For the most part, scientists are acting in good faith with the resources that they have.
Yeah, and my question wasn't so much, and I don't even think Judah Karma or Sariputta felt there was a conspiracy, rather a filter, but not as a conspiratorial, but and they saw it as a human nature. For example, when I was in graduate school, continental drift was a theory that was rejected by many.
Yes, well, you're very old, so
I am.
yeah,
I am. And I even published a paper on it in graduate school.
yeah,
In favor, it was a paper, but neither here nor there. And Meyerhoff was the head of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. To his grave was scissors, no way. And turns out we get this Kuhn called it the paradigm shift.
yeah.
And so paradigm shifts are slow.
Well, sometimes they are,
Yeah.
sometimes they're not. The paradigm shift with plate tectonics certainly was tectonic in speed. I mean, it started with Wegener in the 19th century, and
Yeah.
people thought Wegener was crazy.
Yeah.
And then I'm guessing you were in graduate school in the late 60s. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's when,
Yeah.
That's when it first started to get into the literature that no, there are tectonic plates that they're moving. And then even in the early 80s, people were still not completely on board with it. Now it is, now we have satellites that can measure the rate in which plates are moving. So it's become sacrosanct, the theory of plate tectonics, but that's not true with all theories. Like when Einstein published his theory of relativity, overnight, our entire understanding of the universe changed. So I think that is more the nature of paradigm shifts. Typically science is slow and plodding, and it's iterative, and it's like one person's idea, the next person, and it's kind of dull. And in the modern world, it gets into like minutia, just people need to research something. I remember I saw an interview with Mr. Higgs or Dr. Higgs when they interviewed him when they first found the Higgs boson, and he was giving a speech, and he said, if I were to have to do my research in the modern academic climate, I would have never have discovered this because I wouldn't have had time. There would have just been so much pressure on me to publish another paper and publish another paper and publish another paper that I wouldn't have been able to let this idea breathe at all. And so there's a problem with modern academia and the motivation of modern academia that prevents people from doing the type of research that leads to legitimate paradigm shifts. But when there is a paradigm shift in science, it is pretty dramatic, I think. And so that's what we are looking for with evolution. Darwin was a paradigm shift, and in his day and age, it did kind of happen overnight. I mean, Darwin's theory evolved over about 40 or 50 years. And then it took another 100 years for it to become commonplace in society. And people still aren't buying into it. So maybe he wasn't right, as opposed to Einstein, where it's like, wow, people just realize, wow, this guy discovered something. And so what can we add to this that would actually make it the paradigm shift? And I think that's really what Prabhupada was after. But I do want to, but it's difficult because in my opinion, and this is one of the reasons why I think we're doing this series, is that if we come on in, we need to know what we're up against. And I do want to go back. I do want to read this one letter, if I may, from Srila Prabhupada, which I read often in discussing this topic. This is a letter that Prabhupada wrote to Alachua's own William Ogle Balavanta in 1972.
I have a good letter.
Yeah. Now I want that we shall recruit more and more our men amongst the intelligent class of men, because they are a little educated, or they've got some wealth or fame or ability, so they will be sometimes a little puffed up. But that is all right, they deserve it. Now we shall have to learn the art how to approach such higher class of men and attract them to apply themselves to this Krishna consciousness process of self-realization. That requires much tact, and we shall have to expect to meet all challenges by sharp minds. But if we remain always absorbed in remembering Lord Chaitanya, how he converted so many intelligent men, even sitting for 3 days and nights to hear them speak without himself speaking anything. And if we remember how Krishna was so much patient to explain everything to Arjuna, even Arjuna was speaking like a fool. In this way, being always tolerant of others and appreciating their point of view, it will be an easy matter for us to convince them gradually to join us. So again, my purpose of this presentation is not to say, here's the evidence for evolution, and this is how it is, and just take it. I myself have some issues with it, but I think for the purposes of engendering that paradigm shift that we're looking for, which is a shift away from us seeing the world as an object of our own exploitation for sense gratification, which is really at the root of all theistic objections to Darwinism, is that it takes God out of the picture and it turns the material world into a place that is here for our enjoyment. If we really want to engender that paradigm shift, we need to understand the details of what these people are talking about. And so that's why I'm presenting this information on a somewhat of a lay level, so that when devotees do go out in their missionary work, they're not saying that humans evolved from monkeys, because that's just like a one-way ticket not to be taken seriously.
Yeah, because the theory,
Doesn't say that.
no evolutionist
Right.
says that.
Yeah, and as soon as we say that to an evolutionist, they are not going to take anything else we say seriously.
Well, I do think the flat earthers may have come from monkeys, but it's a different story.
We have a question from Leela.
Go for it.
Pracharananda,
Yes.
thank you so much. This was really, really enlightening. Yeah, I really appreciate it. I have one comment and one question. So I thought it was interesting that once you start talking about epigenetics and, you know, the question of is life fortuitous, that's where it seems to start taking a turn into the metaphysical. And because, you know, what are the implications? What do we care? Just so would you say that that's accurate? It seems like that's where it starts to shift a little bit. To even ask these questions seems like more metaphysical claims. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is when you talked about DNA, is it the blueprint or the template? Would it be philosophically sound to say that the source of all the templates is the Supreme Person? Because where the DNA in our bodies or any living entity on the planet is trying to correct itself, his is that which doesn't require any correction. It's never flawed. And so could we say that and it be an intelligent argument that he is the source of all of that? Because, you know, there are all these theories around DNA and, you know, it starts to get metaphysical and where does it come from? And the theories of, oh, it comes from, you know, extraterrestrials or demigods or all of these things. We can't throw away those ideas. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I mean, to say that Krishna is the source of DNA, I think is not a leap for any faithful person. Of course, Krishna is the source of the DNA. I think it's interesting to look at what DNA is on a chemical level. I mean, DNA is, in reality, a fairly simple molecule. It's one of the four main biological macromolecules, but all it really is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, a little bit of phosphorus, you know. There's not much to it, and it's arranged in a fairly simple structure also. But the nature of its simple structure is that can be wound around itself billions of times, and so you can pack a ridiculous amount of information into a ridiculously small volume, and so that makes it very useful for encoding templates for things. You know, if you want to make this, that, or the other thing, and so we do see that over the entire range of evolutionary patterns we see in nature, there is in fact a universal genetic code, and so that's a miracle. But then to say that's a miracle created by God is removing the conversation out of the realm of science, which is okay. I mean, maybe, you know, we've also talked about how scientific knowledge is not the only valid knowledge system. Science is useful for certain things, and there are certain things that it can't do. And so the origin of these chemicals, scientists cannot explain. Prabhupada repeated this over and over and over again. They cannot make the chemicals. They might be able to organize the chemicals, but they cannot make the chemicals. Nobody can make the chemicals. Even we try to do hot fusion, right? The cold fusion is the holy grail of renewable energy. The reason why we can't do cold fusion is because you need a ridiculous amount of heat and pressure to fuse two hydrogen atoms together. But even if we could do that, we can't make hydrogen atoms. Those were all made by somebody else, somewhere else. And so that's removing the question from the field of science, which is okay in certain contexts. I think from the scientific perspective, we really need to get at this hard problem of what is consciousness. And I don't think we need to look too far to answer this question. The Bhagavatam explains consciousness as a fundamental ingredient of the material nature. And so in the second canto, we read that when Brahma started to manifest varieties of material things out of the Mahatattva, one of those things was consciousness. And then we can read in the third canto, in the teachings of Kapila Dev, more about the details of how consciousness works, how consciousness is operating our knowledge acquiring senses, how consciousness is activating our working senses. And so it's all in there in the Bhagavatam. And my hypothesis is that there is a way to take that information and put it into legitimate scientific research. And that, I think, is the challenge of the BI. I think that's the challenge that Srila Prabhupada gave the BI, that until now we've sort of danced around or floundered about with. And some of that is our own limitations. Some of that is the limitations of technology, which is changing quite a bit. And so I think we have a real opportunity to investigate this, but I think it's also important to do so understanding the real nature of scientific methodology. And that research doesn't mean I'm just going to go read a bunch of books and then summarize what I think about them. That's the beginning of research. You know, we need to come up with testable hypotheses about consciousness. And that's actually what the remainder of this seminar. So I think this was the 6th lecture, maybe it was the 7th. We have a few more to go. And so from that question, we're going to be transferring into how do we study consciousness scientifically? Yeah.
Thank you. Very nice.
I think you showed the slide quoting Dennis Noble.
Yes.
And I think he offers some analysis that is a useful scientific study of the sort of metaphysics that Leela is mentioning in the relationship between DNA and the operation of the cell. Because what he's challenging is the assumption that DNA drives the processes of the cell. Whereas when you really look at what's happening, it seems that the cell is setting its own agenda and deciding to use specific aspects of the DNA code in order to formulate the proteins that it wants to use for its purposes.
Yeah.
And then you show that really nice kind of the different levels within the organism, because the cell seems to be doing that in order to fulfill the tissue's agenda. And the tissue is trying to kind of formulate itself so that it fulfills the organs.
The organs agenda,
and
right.
the organs fit in the systems, and the systems fit in with the organism.
Yeah.
And therefore, there seems to be an opportunity, and he's looking that there's a top-down and action within biology, which has been ignored really simply because of a kind of paradigm prejudice that everything is bottom-up and that we have to explain from the simple to the complex.
And that takes us to intelligent design.
And that, whereas the biology seems to be suggesting we should be looking at the organism and its purpose, which is of course related to consciousness. And consciousness is a response to the environment. That's what it's all about. We want to be happy and enjoy life.
Well, I think the question there is we would need to describe how the needs of the organism arose before the machinery in which the organism operates. But that is consciousness, right? Yeah. So Christina.
Yes,
Thank you for articulating that a lot better than I did also. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the talk. It reminded me a lot of computer science or programming, because the example with the single-celled organism and the flagellum, and cutting off the flagellum and taking out the genetic material and everything, and then it kind of like got rewritten. It kind of what I thought about was like you're like a programmer and you're like coding this this program which has a lot of different kind of sub-functions, and then one of the files that has the code for one of the sub-functions accidentally gets deleted, and you're like, oh damn it, I have to rewrite this.
Yeah.
Because you have the idea of what the flip function is supposed to do and how it fits into the whole system of the software, and so you go back and you're like, okay, well, I know what it's supposed to do, so I guess I'll like write the code again.
Right.
And you write it, and it's not exactly
the same code,
as it was before, but it kind of does the same thing.
Right.
And I also think about how like DNA being having these templates instead of being the blueprint. It reminds me of how in software you have like these software libraries, and so you import these libraries when you're starting to code a software program, because you're like, okay, in this program I'm going to want to ping a server to tell what the time is. I'm going to import the library that like helps me do that. And so you can kind of draw upon these, like pull on these to incorporate, but like you as a programmer, you're always the one kind of calling the shots, and you're the one who has the vision of it.
Right.
that's
Good
what that kind of-
metaphor.
Yeah.
That's what that
Good
makes
metaphor.
me go.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
All right. Anybody else?
Anything in the chat?
Nothing
Nope,
in
nothing
the
in
chat. Swami Padmanabha, he asked me this question on Facebook the other day, which I do want to address, and he was asking about how so to just taking a step back from the whole thing and trying to look at what we see as evolution in the context of the Bhagavatam. He was asking how the idea of a linear evolution fits into the cyclical nature of time that we see in the Bhagavatam. So if I just may very briefly comment about that for the record. So if we look, and I spoke about time last week, and if we look at the life of Brahma, this is well beyond any time frame we can even possibly conceive of, even considering deep time of the universe. So the life of Lord Brahma is 311 some odd trillion years. The known age of the universe, or the believed age of the universe, is I'm rounding here to the nearest whole billion, 14 billion years. And that changes by a couple 100 million years every now and then. And then the span, the time scale in which we look at evolution on Earth is over the span of about 4 billion years, which is about the length of a day of Brahma. And so if we consider time and the cycles of time from the perspective of Lord Brahma, what we would observe as linear evolution on the Earth right now is almost impossible to observe. It happens in such a moment that we wouldn't really see a linear chain of evolution as we observe in the fossil record. Rather, we would see a constant reshuffling of the 8.4 million species of life that are present on this Earth at any one given time. So just to put that in a little bit of perspective, the Tyrannosaurus Rex, everybody's favorite dinosaur, lived closer in time to humans than it did to the Triceratops, which is everybody's second favorite dinosaur, right? Triceratops is the guy with the big shield on his head and the spiky things, and Tyrannosaurus Rex is. So Tyrannosaurus Rex lived at the end of the Cretaceous period, which is about 65 million years ago, so 65 million years away from us. The Triceratops lived at the beginning of the Triassic, which was about 285 million years ago. So there were 200 million years of time between the Triceratops and the Tyrannosaurus, but there's only 65 million years between Tyrannosaurus and us. And from the perspective of a demigod, that just looks like a petri dish, basically, of bewildered living entities.
The point you're making
yeah,
was first published in 1972 by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge,
yeah,
and in their Punctuated Equilibrium. Then in 1976 or so, 1977, they published, well, it's been 5 years, no one has defeated us, therefore our theory stands.
yeah.
That was their initial papers. Of course, there's been a lot done since then, but they were dealing with this very difficult problem that evolution occurs so slowly that we don't see it in our lifetimes. I mean, we
Yeah.
see, we can certainly, generate a new kind of chihuahua, but they're still dogs.
Right.
And evolution, so it occurs so slow, we don't see it, but so fast in that ephemeral spot that it's the details and missing links are not preserved in the fossil record. So they're dealing with that observation.
Well, I mean, this again opens up a big doorway for people
Yeah.
who want to be skeptical, is that, the number of fossils, especially the number of complete fossils by which we tell the story of hominid evolution, are vanishingly small. It's not like there's hundreds of fossils of Homo erectus.
No,
there are
very
17,000 fossils of Homo habilis. It's like there are 2 of them.
Here and
Right.
yeah, and that's a good point. The way they dealt with that, they said, well, 100 years ago, we'd say, we're going to find it. But now, after 100 years of searching, we haven't found enough missing links. Therefore, evolution is occurring too fast to lead.
No, I don't, I
much
think that
evidence.
is a disingenuous argument. I think that
Well, that's their
they
argument.
No, I think that's,
Yeah.
well, maybe I misunderstand what you're saying,
Yeah.
but I think religious people and devotees, they always, the missing link, the missing link, the missing link. The scientists have found many missing links, but they found one example of the missing link, and they use that to tell
Yeah.
a whole story. So it's not that
Well, I'm quoting them. They're saying there
Yeah.
weren't enough, therefore they.
Oh, I see
said
what you're
that
saying.
we're
Okay.
going to deal with it temporarily and say it occurs too slow for us to observe it, but too fast for us to have a lot of them in the fossil record. Therefore, we're coming up with another theory of how it occurs, and we're calling it punctuated equilibrium.
Right, and I brought this, thank you
Yeah,
for clarifying
yeah,
that, and
yeah.
I brought this image up here because these dotted lines here
Yeah.
show, which certainly Darwin did not know about,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
even Prabhupada didn't know about. I mean, you mentioned,
Yeah.
these guys published that in 1972. So these are known mass extinction events on Earth, and they
Yeah.
are periodic, and they do create rapid bottleneck effects and rapid new speciation of habitats that are left
Yeah.
behind. And so you can see where new taxa evolve immediately subsequent to mass extinction events. So Gould's ideas have been well substantiated by and refined also by the fossil record. But I think the issue here is not with, so we tend to see these issues where there's not a lot of fossils. If you go to the American Museum of Natural History and you see the dinosaur, there's only 2 real dinosaur bones in them. That is a feature of science. That's not a flaw. That is a flaw and a feature of science, I would say. So the nature of science is that we come up with the best explanation that we can, given the evidence that's available to us.
Well, so and to Gould and Eldredge said, we have a problem with the evidence, therefore the mechanism of evolution must be different than we thought of prior to their paper. And they came up with a theory of a different mechanism. Now, Saraput and I did a paper on that their alternative was flawed. Now, what's the significance of all this? The significance, I'm trying to say, is that what really happened is still an area of mystery that requires study. The danger for those who are devotees are to doing outreach work is to oversimplify it. And you've corrected that today. There's a lot of complexity here. There's a huge amount of data. You can't sweep it under a rug. So, yeah.
You can't sweep it under the rug. And I also want to point out, again, using this document and what you just said about changing or redefining the mechanism, or the the data doesn't fit the explanation, is not Stephen Jay Gould doing bad science. That's Stephen Jay Gould doing excellent science.
No, I thought Stephen Jay Gould, I mean, and I met him, I went to his lectures. I thought he did excellent science, and he pointed out that the common belief that natural selection doesn't work in the way the textbooks to this day will say it works. He brought up the new idea, and I won't go into it now, it's too technical, of speciation as a different mechanism,
So,
isolated populations.
Hold on 1 second. Modern textbooks definitely talk about punctuated equilibrium
Okay.
as the main and
Okay,
speciation.
I stand correct. Okay.
Yeah, that is
Maybe I'm
definitely
looking at older books,
in
but
the textbooks.
that's good. But Saraput and I, when we looked at it, felt that what Stephen Jay Gould did was clearly not the final word, and there's something else going on, and it takes us to your final point.
Yeah.
And Bruce Lipton, in his book on epigenetics, goes down this road, and he was considered a nutcase, and now you can't find a biology paper without the word epigenetics in there somewheres. And when he wrote his book, he was considered a nutcase. That there's a lot more work to be done to understand what's going on. And from the BI's point of view, that more work involves consciousness as a driving mechanism. And as a working assumption, if that is true, what I'm saying, there is experiments that could lead in that direction. That's the point I'm trying to make. It is an area that can be explored. The danger is on the scientist side to say, we got it all, because Gould and others demonstrated they don't.
I
They-
guess this is the point that I'm trying to make by saying
Yeah.
science
Yeah.
wasn't doing bad science, he was doing excellent scientists.
Yeah.
I think most scientists who take this
Yeah.
topic seriously don't object to that. They know there's a lot more work.
Yeah, yeah, and
And I just let me just say that
Yeah.
when we, and so this gets to kind of preaching style and preaching motivation. And one of the things that we were trying to do with this update on the origin was to strike a more reconciliatory rather than combative tone. And so I think it is important to understand that most, if not all, good scientists know that their scientific knowledge is limited. And if we come at them with an attitude of, you know, you think you know it all, or you're the puffed up scientist, or whatever, that's another reason why they're just not going to listen
okay,
to
well,
us.
let me finish the second half of what I was saying. First half was that the current scientific models need a lot more work. And as you're saying, scientists
Yeah.
admit it. The other half is to think that we have all the explanations and we understand the whole mechanism, how it works, is also flawed, because we don't. And when people ask me, what is the explanation for this or that phenomena, I'm not shy to say, well, that's something I don't know. And it requires research, which may be digging into Shastra, digging into science. It requires a lot of research. So there's a lot of I don't knows on both sides of this, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, so there's a chapter in the Bhagavatam, in the second canto, says the Srimad Bhagavatam is the answer to all questions, and the Srimad Bhagavatam is definitely the answer to all questions. And the answer to all questions is that we should just chant Hare Krishna and eat more gulab jamuns. And it says that in the Bhagavatam.
Yeah.
Maybe not the gulab jamun part, but also the gulab jamun
But if
part.
if it didn't say
So,
that, it
but
should.
here's the thing, like if you get a math textbook, all of the answers to all of the math problems in the textbook are in the back of the textbook. So the math book has the answer to all the problems also, but just because you know the answer to the problem just because you know the answer to the question doesn't mean you know how to solve the problem.
Exactly.
And so so it is all there in the Bhagavatam, but that doesn't mean first of all, we as, you know, fledgling Kanishta Adhikaris, if I may, you know, have the Adhikar to really understand what it all is. And so and this is a foreshadowing of the next work. So that's really where our work is, you know, it is on the Bhagavatam, but how do we develop the Adhikar to understand it? Because it is extremely difficult to understand. And even though we've been going to universities for 50 years and explaining it to people to the best of our ability, it's not quite catching on, or it's catching on in ways that are, you know, basically, frankly, tend towards Mayavad. The Nobel Prize in Physics this year was an amazing discovery that lends directly towards Mayavad philosophy. The idea that quantum entanglement takes place over intergalactic scales, and that there's no real local reality to objects, is I believe what it was, which was one of Einstein's fundamental premises.
Which
is why I asked you that question. But so I think the idea here is to use the scientific evidence that's there, because there's a lot of work that's been done into that, and we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but offer a different perspective on what that evidence can mean. And in order to do that, we need to understand what that evidence is quite deeply, and we need to understand the metaphysics of the Bhagavatam equally as deeply. And that is a monumental challenge, I think.
That's why I like your talk. It does that. Very well done.
It doesn't do any of that. It just sets this. It just sets
the
agenda.
stage.
Yeah,
No, I don't mean you got the answers.
Oh God, no, I don't know anything.
I know.
Yeah.
Are we saying that we object to this the mechanism, you know, of how, you know, evolution occurred? You know, the template versus the blueprint and the role of consciousness, or in agreeing with, you know, these things did happen, you know, as far as the picture that scientists paint going 4 billion years ago, going from pretty much lifeless to now a Earth, you know, full of variety.
Well, I think if we're going to be faithful to the Vedic Siddhanta, And I don't think it says in the Bhagavatam that there are 8.4 million species of life, but it definitely says in other sattvic and recognized Puranas that these 8.4 million species of life are always existing and are immutable. And Prabhupada emphasized that point whenever this conversation came up. So I don't think that this was just a passing comment that Prabhupada made, as he made, perhaps even his passing comments about the moon landing. I think there's substantively something different about Prabhupada's comment about that. And I do think we need to be faithful and bear that in mind when addressing this topic. And that being said, I think that explanation doesn't necessarily contradict the evidence that's out there. And in some cases, is actually quite in line with the evidence that's out there. So I think it's more of a nuanced question than do we believe this or believe that, but it's more of, pulling on different strands of what we know, what we're told, and what we can kind of figure out, which are the three levels of evidence, right? Pratyaksha, Anuman, Shabda. And we put these three things together as individuals to come up with our realizations of what the material world is all about.
Just to come in on that one, because it's an important question. I think we have to study our own Shastra deeply and understand the metaphysics. And we've got to be very careful of conflating concepts that science uses in order to categorize the world, and the way the Bhagavatam analyzes Sankhya and counts the world. And species, I think, is a very good example. They're not the same thing.
Yeah.
The definition of species is a huge question for biology and zoology. And there's lots of different ways of categorizing it. That, history of life, or that tree of life, can be categorized in lots of different ways, morphologically. DNA will look at it differently and make different connections, So what is a species in scientific terms is a big discussion for them. And I don't believe that it is the same as the way Bhagavatam is using jati as a species. And the 8.4 million species the Bhagavatam talks, or rather the Puranas talk about, and we haven't been able to track down that verse within the Padma Purana, the Vishnu Purana. We cannot find it. It's quoted, lost by Prabhupada, so probably, we take it seriously.
He says it's in the Padma Purana, but we can't
find it in the Padma. Another place says Vishnu Purana, and we can't find it there either. But the other point about, which I think is very important, is the correlation of, if you like, the history that is given for all the different species appearing on Earth, and the way the Bhagavatam talks about it. The Bhagavatam certainly says that all species are created at the beginning of creation. So you're going back 150 trillion years. That is the templates. That is like, it's a higher level of what we were talking about in terms of the cell and DNA. It's like what Christina was saying, is you've got a library of data for, this is what a species like this, and the Gita talks about a species or a body being a group of senses gathered around the mind. And that's the best way to look at all of these different creatures. They've got a set of knowledge acquiring senses and a set of action or working senses, the karmendriyas. So every creature has just slightly different
that gives us different levels of agency,
exactly, according to levels of consciousness. So it links consciousness with perception and volition. So those templates exist from the beginning of the universe. I'm personally into the idea, the way the Bhagavatam describes it, that at different times throughout this huge period that you were describing of the life of Brahma, and within a day, and even the day is divided into the manvantars, and during different manvantar periods, the Devatas are kind of looking, well, what are the populations needed on Earth at this point?
Right.
And they reach into that template of eternal, that library of eternal templates, and say, oh, we need a population of cows, oh, maybe we need a population of bees, and so on. And therefore, what we would expect to see is this picture that in the history of Earth, as we are able to kind of analyze it, we would see different species popping up at different times. And I think there is a metaphysical process at work behind that. And therefore, we're not, I don't see any reason to argue with the history of species as they are shown.
Yeah.
Do I think that it shows that one species goes into another? I'm atheist on
One
that.
species.
One species transforming
Did
into
a deer
another.
mouse become a whale?
I think that's not necessary.
And the problem is it occurs too fast.
And it does,
That
and
creates an
I
issue.
think there's a lot of questions about how that could happen in a mechanism. Now, I appreciate that the mechanism I'm suggesting of David is using a mystical kind of process, which I think is described in the Bhagavatam, for punctuated appearances.
Yeah.
But at least I think that punctuated appearance fits the history.
I mean, it's also not a totally outlandish theory. I'm using theory loosely now. There's the theory of panspermia, which is the idea that genetic material on this Earth came from outer space. So, maybe the Earth was populated by a
that's
race
not
of
the
apes.
biggest contender, actually.
Yeah, that and the hydrothermal vents. We can talk about hydrothermal vents another time.
You said something. You said something very early on in your lecture about how scientists, for a new theory to come about, it has to fulfill certain requirements. I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could restate.
Well, I think this image from that I was showing and Gould's contributions is a good example of that. So the original Darwinian mechanism was that the modification with descent happens very slowly and incrementally in a uniformitarian type setting. Gould brought in the idea of punctuated equilibrium based on a limited set of data.
Not sure
but-
you're getting at what I was asking.
Hold on one second, guys. I'm not done. Maybe I'm not. But so he revised Darwin's theory based on a new but limited set of data. But it turns out that his revision of Darwin's theory predicted what is observed in nature better than Darwin did. And so that's what the addition of these dotted lines here means, is that it shows that the new speciation didn't occur gradually over time as Darwin predicted, but it actually occurred in these kind of distinct short-lived events, which was what his theory. And then if you fit the data to his theory, it fits his theory better. So his theory is more predictive than Darwin. So it was an advance in that sense. And that was one of the criteria.
You had it on
theory.
the slide. The
Yeah.
words were actually like, I would guess, one of your first 5 slides.
There we go.
Yeah, that last.
So the one I was just talking about is this one here, is that the new theory gave better predictions or fit the data better than the older theories. And then
So my point was that if we're going to have a new outlook, it has to do that.
and this is my, I don't want to say beef, but this is my challenge to the BI is that, because it does boil down to consciousness, and it is very difficult to talk about consciousness in scientific terms. So we know how do we talk about science consciousness in scientific terms? And again, that's what I'm hoping to talk about in the next few weeks. And I know that other people are addressing the same topic in other things. So I think we should call it.
Yeah, that is an excellent segue. Please tune in next week and subsequent Sundays as Vicharananda and the crew explore explore consciousness and then
Psychonauts.
become psychonauts and explore consciousness in scientific ways in this wonderful new frontier. Thank you very much for joining us.
And next Saturday, we have a whole day seminar beginning at 10 o'clock, same station, tune in, and it's by Kandidi, sitting behind me, and he'll be presenting the Atma Paradigm, or the Conscious Explorer's Handbook, as we're calling it nowadays. Workshop. And it's a 30-hour seminar
How are you gonna do that in one day?
condensed into one day. He's using Einsteinian time dilation.
If I
I
had
assume,
Einsteinian time dilation, I'd be making-
and so it'll be fast moving, interesting, and I 100% guarantee you, I've seen it a few times, 100% guarantee you, not boring. Our two goals are to keep you awake and make you think. And next Saturdays will do it. I hope you can join us. Is it the same Zoom link? You go to the,
It's not the same Zoom link.
okay, go to BI.
It's on the
BI
events subpage on the bihsstudies.org
Yeah,
webpage.
bihstudies.org, events, and it's there. There's a button you click so you can register if you'll be here in person, because we will have snacks and prasadam, and we want to make sure everyone gets served. Thank you very much.
Haribo.